Hello and welcome to this presentation by Thermate Solutions. I am Prasanna Kumar, retired professor, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, India. Thermate Solutions was founded in 2010 out of continuous research, consultancy and software development work carried out for more than 3 decades. We are a company based in Bengaluru, India, dedicated to providing solutions for process simulation and quality control in manufacturing. InverseSOLVER software, heat treatment simulator, automated ASTM standard Inconel quench probe, reference quench probe are our main products. We also provide consultancy in the design of sensors and test rigs in conjunction with the use of our specialized software InverseSOLVER. We have our customers from manufacturing companies, research institutions, national laboratories, universities from India and USA. We will take a look at our flagship product InverseSOLVER, a software for estimating heat flux in any manufacturing process. It relies on live time temperature data collected from test rigs as the only input. Process conditions can be replicated in the laboratory also. No assumptions are involved with the InverseSOLVER, hence a reliable tool for estimating the unknowns in complex manufacturing processes. We will then present some industrial case studies. One of the biggest problems in thermal process simulation and control is the estimation of heat flux, the rate at which heat energy is transferred from one system to the other, from one component to the other. There is hardly any manufacturing method where heat transfer does not play a crucial role. Take metal casting. An estimate of heat flux is essential for ensuring directional solidification. Selection of mold coats, chills in metal casting, etc. are governed by the heat transferred from the liquid metal to the mold. In heat treatment, the selection of proper quench media affects the final properties of the components. It is an essential input for process simulation, design of thermal systems, elimination of defects in manufacturing, etc. How do we quantify or measure it? Though we have sensors for measuring heat flux, say in a furnace atmosphere by flux meters, we cannot measure the heat flux when the process is inaccessible, like between the mold and the casting at the mold metal interface, or when it is too complex for calculations like during quenching. Spray heat transfer, heat due to a plasma or a welding arc are some other examples where heat flux cannot be directly measured. We can only estimate it by mathematical means. InverseSOLVER is the tool which can estimate the heat flux in all such cases. Let us see how InverseSOLVER works. We take here an example where a heated steel rod is quenched from one end by a jet of water. It is required to estimate the heat flux. The physics of water spray makes it very complicated for calculation by CFD approach. What we can do, however, is to measure the rate of cooling of the rod by a thermocouple located a few millimeters below the surface. By doing so, we will be measuring the effect of water jet. The process of calculating the cause from the effect is known as inverse solution. And the temperature is recorded till the end. The measured temperature is the only input to InverseSOLVER apart from the known material properties, thermal conductivity, specific heat and density of the rod material. In the next step, we assume a heat flux and solve for the temperature at the thermocouple location, which is known as direct solution. This is done by finite element method. The error in the computed and measured temperature is calculated, and in the next step, a correction is applied to the assumed heat flux based on the error, and the steps are repeated till the error in the computed and the measured temperature is within an acceptable limit. Though the solution looks simple, mathematically it is not so, as the problem is classified as ill-post, and therefore it requires special procedures called stabilization or regularization. InverseSOLVER addresses these issues related to conduction heat transfer with variable properties of materials, transformation of austenite during heat treatment with latent heat, conversion of TTT diagram into CCT diagram, hardness of quenched microstructures, and tempered hardness. It is thus especially applicable for estimation of heat transfer coefficient during quenching heat treatment. Let us now look at some of the industrial cases where inverse solver was successfully applied. Many a times, surface cracks appear in induction hardened components, like in this case, a camshaft. Cracks and warping are common defects in heat treatment which are due to excessive and non-uniform thermal stresses during quenching. The solution lied in reducing the heat flux due to spraying of the quenchant. 4 thermocouples connected to data loggers were inserted at strategic locations 5 mm below the surface of one cam lobe. Time temperature data were recorded over one complete cycle of heating and quenching. This data was then used as input to the inverse solver to obtain heat flux due to quenching and surface temperature all along the cam lobe. An analysis of the output data from inverse solver clearly showed excessive thermal stresses developing on the surface of the cam lobe, which led to surface cracks. This was attributed to the cooling characteristics of the quenchant, which was altered by reducing the concentration of the PAG polymer. This case clearly brings out the efficacy of inverse solver, where even surface temperature can be estimated with sufficient accuracy, which is not possible otherwise in practical cases of quenching heat treatment. Let us look at another case of quenching heat treatment where it was necessary to understand why a certain variation of hardness along the periphery of steel rods, typically of 90 mm diameter, was observed. The hardness was found to vary from 43 to 48 HRC. The planned practice was to stack the rods horizontally in containers, preheat them in the furnace, and lower them into an open quench tank. A non-uniform soaking at the time of withdrawal from the furnace and flow of the quenchant around the periphery of the rod were anticipated because of stacking. A test rig was designed to collect the time temperature data during heating and quenching. 4 thermocouples were inserted 90 degrees apart, 5 mm below the surface, along the periphery of the rod. The data was used as input to inverse solver, and the results showed the maximum surface cooling rates varied widely, from 73 degrees centigrade per second at the top to 320 degrees centigrade per second on the left side, with the maximum heat flux showing similar variations. There was also an asymmetrical heat flux distribution which showed the influence of neighboring rods affecting the flow rate of the quenchant. This procedure can be usefully employed to design optimum stacking sequence for immersion quenching in containers. Another example where hardness can be estimated at interior locations in objects like forming dies during gas quenching is illustrated in this case. By measuring temperatures at the interiors, the hardness at the location can be estimated. 1 mm diameter holes were drilled to reach the location where hardness was required, and thermocouples were inserted through these holes. Again, time temperature data was collected during heating and subsequent gas quenching of the die. In this case, as it was just the hardness at the location was of interest, inverse solver was used to track austenite decomposition based on the real time temperature data and estimate the resultant microstructure and hardness. When the procedure was run on a sample, the results were within 1 HRC. 3 types of steel samples were used: DAC, H13 and Orvar Supreme. This procedure can be adopted for estimating the hardness at remote locations inside a large object without recourse to destructive testing or detailed simulation. Inverse solver can also be used for gaining an insight into the quenching process. In one of the cases referred to as, a low carbon steel C25 grade component showed an anomalous behavior when quenched in a specific quenchant. The core showed slightly higher hardness than the surface. To analyze the problem and find a solution, the time temperature data at 4 mm below the surface of the component was obtained during quenching. Apart from the surface heat flux, which is the primary output of InverseSOLVER, the surface temperature can also be obtained. In this case, the surface temperature showed a clear recalcitrance, a sort of flattening of the cooling curve at the surface. The temperature at the recalcitrance matched with the nose of the TTT diagram of the steel. Further analysis showed that at recalcitrance, the ferrite and perlite formation was promoted, leading to lower hardness, while at the core, the cooling was continuous and supported martensite formation. This case showed the importance of choosing the proper quenchant based on its cooling characteristics. So far, we have shown how InverseSOLVER can be used in the heat treatment industry for tackling many common problems. Here is an example where it can find its use in the die casting industry. During die casting of high temperature alloys like SG iron in cast iron dies, the use of mold coats is mandatory to control heat transfer from the liquid metal to the mold. The selection of the proper coating material and thickness are important to ensure long die life and optimum productivity. In a case referred to as, a series of experiments were conducted to collect thermal data with different coating material and thicknesses. Design guidelines were developed on the basis of the heat flux at the metal mold interface, which were obtained by running InverseSOLVER. A typical guideline could be like a minimum of say 200 micron soot thickness must be ensured for keeping the heat flux at a maximum of 500 kilowatt per meter square. A second guideline could be the die wall thickness must be around 30 millimeters on an average for a 200 micron soot thickness. Such guidelines cannot, however, be taken as universal, as the heat transfer conditions depend on the casting geometry, size, weight. We will now move on to an equipment based on InverseSOLVER. The equipment is called the reference quench probe. One of the common equipment used for measuring the cooling characteristics of quenchants in the heat treatment industry is the Inconel quench probe, defined under ASTM D6200 and ISO 9950. The Inconel probe can be used for comparing quenchants only under laboratory conditions. It is common knowledge that quenchants behave differently when agitated, as it is the case in the plant. The cooling behavior of a quenchant is also affected by contamination, oxidation, turbidity, etc. The reference quench probe was developed to assess the suitability of a quenchant for a specific grade of steel under plant conditions. It uses a specimen of the same grade of steel as being quenched and is designed specifically for use with InverseSOLVER. When deployed in the plant, a reference quench probe outputs the heat flux at the surface of the specimen, the maximum cooling rate at the surface, microstructure and hardness variation from the surface to the core. The reference quench probe combined with InverseSOLVER can thus be used for measuring the cooling characteristics of quenchants under the exact plant conditions, taking into account all the variables affecting heat treatment of a component. Presently, the reference quench probe is a simple handheld unit with a sensor attached at one end and the data logger housed in the other end. Along with the furnace, it can be deployed near the quench tank and the data collected for further analysis. The equipment is being robotized with automated heating, quenching and data transmission in accordance with the modern trend in digital manufacturing. We will now give a couple of illustrations on the use of reference quench probe. The slide shows the results obtained by quenching a 25 mm diameter 100 CR6 grade steel specimen attached to the reference quench probe in two oils. The graphs show clearly that oil A has a maximum heat flux of 1.1 megawatt per meter square at 700 degrees centigrade, while oil B showed a maximum heat flux of 1.6 megawatt per meter square at around 645 degrees. As the success of heat treatment depends on achieving adequate cooling rates at the right temperature, such plant data is expected to give proper guidance in the selection of quenchants. InverseSOLVER can be used for quenching simulation of case-hardened steels also. The carbon-rich case is divided into 5 zones of varying carbon concentrations. Each zone is treated as a different steel with its own TTT diagram. Tests were conducted with reference quench probe covering different furnaces and quench tanks in an auto component manufacturing facility to develop nomograms relating average cooling rate and hardness. Such tools can be used for quality control by conducting periodic tests. A basic input required for the simulation of quenching is the heat transfer coefficient as a function of surface temperature. As immersion quenching is accompanied by boiling, heat transfer simulation by first principles is a daunting task. Using InverseSOLVER, data can be generated for building a model for heat transfer coefficient for specific steel quenchant combination. The equipment designed for modeling HTC uses steel samples of diameters varying from 10 to 25 mm made of a specific grade of steel. A thermocouple records the time temperature data at the midsection of the specimen as it is quenched. The data is then used as input to InverseSOLVER to obtain the surface heat flux. The slide shows a regression model based on this procedure. The equipment has automated transfer of heated probe for immersion in the quench vessel, a feature which can be used with Inconel quench probe as well. To conclude, InverseSOLVER can be used in all cases where process is inaccessible for direct measurement, for the estimation of metal mold heat transfer for casting simulation, efficient design of water or spray cooling systems, selection of mold coat material and thickness in die casting for increased die life, measurement of contact conductance across metallic or non-metallic contacts, measurement of heat flux in all types of welding, friction welding, etc. for quality control, modeling heat transfer coefficient in boiling, condensation, radiation, forced convection, in space technology for design of heat shields and the like, in nuclear technology for design of complex cooling systems. InverseSOLVER, coupled with the newly designed tool reference quench probe, can be used for in situ determination of cooling characteristics of quenchants of all types. Thermet Solutions acknowledges the support extended by the organizers of this virtual conference in reaching a wider audience worldwide. We hope the information in this presentation would be useful for manufacturers and designers of thermal systems. Thanks for your kind attention.